The first time Eliza Calloway set foot in Dustfield, Colorado, a man grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, and the only thing standing between her and a night she would never have recovered from was a stranger with fists like sledgehammers and eyes the color of a winter sky. It was the summer of 1873, and Dustfield was the kind of town that had grown too fast for its own decency. Silver had been pulled from the mountains northeast of town just 2 years prior, and with the silver had come the saloons, the gambling dens, the men who spent their weeks in the mines and their weekends drowning whatever it was they were running from. The main street, if you could call it that, was a long spine of packed earth and horse dung running between 2 rows of storefronts that leaned against each other like weary travelers. The Dustfield Hotel sat at one end, its painted sign already peeling in the dry Colorado heat. The Silver Spur Saloon sat at the other, and between those 2 establishments lay every manner of human ambition, greed, and longing that the frontier could produce. Eliza had come on the afternoon stage from Denver, arriving with a single leather trunk, a hat box, and a letter of employment from the Dustfield Schoolhouse Committee. She was 22 years old. With dark chestnut hair she wore pinned beneath a travel bonnet, and brown eyes that held a steadiness that had taken years to grow into. She had grown up in Missouri, lost her mother to cholera when she was 14, helped her father run a dry goods store until he passed of a weak heart 2 winters ago, and found herself at 22 with no family, no prospects, and a notice in a Denver newspaper advertising for a schoolteacher willing to take a post in a newly settled mining town. She had answered that advertisement with the particular kind of courage that belongs only to people who have already lost everything and therefore have very little left to fear. The stage pulled to a stop in front of the hotel in the late afternoon when the sun was still high enough to press its full weight on the shoulders of anyone foolish enough to stand in it. Eliza stepped down from the coach onto the street, and the dust rose around her boots in small, warm clouds, settling immediately on the hem of her traveling dress, which was a sensible dark blue serge that had nonetheless survived the journey looking considerably worse than when it had started. The air smelled of horses and pine resin, and something metallic that she would later understand was the smell of the mines themselves carried on the mountain wind. She stood for a moment taking in the town, her trunk at her feet, the hat box in her hand, and the letter from the school committee folded inside her traveling bag. There were men on the boardwalk across the street watching her with the particular attention that a woman alone always attracted in places like this, and Eliza met each gaze with the steady brown eyes of someone who had been stared at before and had learned that looking away only invited more of the same. The hotel clerk, a thin man named Mr. Pruitt with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, was perfectly pleasant. He showed her to a room on the 2nd floor, informed her that supper was served at 6, and told her with some evident pride that the school committee chairman, a Mr. Harlan Briggs, would call on her in the morning to discuss the details of her employment. Eliza thanked him, set her trunk at the foot of the narrow bed, and stood at the window looking out at the main street of Dustfield in the amber light of the approaching evening. She had intended to stay in her room that first night. She had intended to eat supper in the hotel dining room, speak to no one, and go to bed early after 3 days of stagecoach travel that had left every bone in her body feeling as though it had been individually removed, shaken, and replaced slightly wrong. She had intended all of that. What she had not intended was to discover, when she went downstairs at 5:30 to ask Mr. Pruitt about the nearest mercantile, that the hotel dining room did not open until 7, that she had not eaten since a dry biscuit and a strip of tough jerked beef at the noon stop outside of Castle Rock, and that the only establishment on the street that appeared to serve food at this hour was the Silver Spur Saloon. She stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel, with her stomach making its opinion clear, and considered her options. She had heard of women eating in saloons. It was not entirely unheard of, particularly in frontier towns where social conventions had not yet hardened into the rigid forms they took back east. The saloon likely had a kitchen, or at least a cook who kept a pot of something going. She would go in, ask for something to eat it at a table in a corner, and leave. Perfectly simple. What she did not account for was that it was a Friday evening in a mining town, and that the Silver Spur Saloon at 5:30 on a Friday evening in 1873, was already 3/4 full of men who had been drinking since the afternoon shift ended. The noise hit her before she even pushed through the doors. Voices and laughter and the clinking of glasses, and someone playing a honky-tonk piano badly but enthusiastically, all of it compressed into a low-ceilinged room thick with tobacco smoke and the particular human warmth of too many bodies in too small a space. Eliza pushed through the swinging doors with her chin up and her eyes forward, looking for a corner table, looking for a barmaid, looking for any woman at all who might serve as a social landmark in this sea of male attention. She found a small table near the far wall, next to a shuttered window, and she sat down and placed her reticule in her lap and waited. The piano kept going. Conversation continued around her, though she was aware of the way it shifted and rearranged itself to accommodate her presence. Several men glanced at her and then looked away. A few glanced and did not look away. A barmaid came by eventually, a large, cheerful woman named Dot, who wore her gray hair pinned in a complicated arrangement and moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had seen everything twice. Eliza asked for whatever was hot from the kitchen and a cup of coffee, and Dot nodded with approval and disappeared. The trouble came before the food did. There were 5 of them, she counted afterward, though in the moment it felt like considerably more. They were minors, young, the kind of young that means reckless, with the sunburned faces and dust-ingrained hands that came from working the shafts. The one who came to her table first was a broad-shouldered boy who could not have been much older than she was, with sandy hair and eyes that were already swimming in whiskey. He set both hands on her table and leaned over it, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers, and said something that she would not have repeated in polite company. Eliza said, very calmly, that she was waiting for her supper and would appreciate being left alone. The man laughed. His friends, who had drifted over with the particular gravity of groups who sense entertainment, laughed with him. She said it again. Her voice did not shake. She had learned, after her father died, and she had to manage the store alone and deal with suppliers and creditors and the occasional difficult customer, that a steady voice could do a great deal. It could hold a room. It could buy time. It could, sometimes, turn aside trouble before it arrived. Not tonight. The sandy-haired man reached across the table and took hold of her wrist, and the men behind him surged forward with the boneless enthusiasm of the drunk, and the noise in the saloon changed character, the piano stopping mid-note, and the whole room holding its breath in that suspended moment before things went irretrievably wrong. And then the crowd parted. She heard him before she saw him, because the sound he made moving through that crowd was not loud, but it was unmistakable, the sound of something large and immovable coming through space that other things had the good sense to clear. And then she saw him, and in the years that followed, she would sometimes try to describe this first sight of Caleb Holt to people who had not been there, and she never quite managed it to her satisfaction. He was enormous. That was the first and most immediate fact of him. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they made the doorframe behind him look modest, and arms that spoke of years of the kind of work that does not come from a gymnasium, but from split timber and hauled stone and pulled rope and everything else the mountain demands of the men who live on it. His hair was dark brown and longer than fashion strictly permitted, falling past his collar in loose waves, and his jaw was covered in a beard that was neither the careful cultivation of a city man nor the wild neglect of someone who had given up, but something in between, something that suited him the way everything about him seemed to suit the unmediated physical facts of the world. He was wearing a canvas shirt that had been washed many times and a pair of dark trousers and boots that had mud on them from the trail. He was not carrying a gun that she could see, which struck her later as the remarkable thing, because he walked like a man who did not need one. He came to her table in 3 strides and put his hand on the sandy-haired man's forearm, the one attached to the hand that was gripping Eliza's wrist, and he did not squeeze hard, or at least it did not appear that he squeezed hard, but the sandy-haired man's face went white and then red, and he let go of Eliza's wrist immediately and took a half-step backward. "That is not how you treat a lady," Caleb Holt said. His voice was deep and even, the kind of voice that carries without needing to be raised. "Step back." The sandy-haired man made the mistake of not stepping back. He made the further mistake of swinging first. Eliza had read about brawls in dime novels and found them absurd and theatrical. She revised this opinion in the next 4 minutes as she sat very still against the far wall and watched Caleb Holt take on the 5 miners who had come to her table. He did not fight with any particular grace or elegance. He fought with the utter mechanical efficiency of a man who had done hard physical labor every day of his adult life and had arms like forge-worked iron and the kind of endurance that comes from living at altitude. And the 5 miners, drunk and surprised and finding very quickly that the sum of their combined weight and fury was not equal to the focused application of this particular man's strength, were dispatched one by one or in pairs across the floor and into the furniture with a thoroughness that left the saloon significantly quieter than it had been before. The last one, the sandy-haired one who had started it, ended up sitting on the floor against the bar with his nose bleeding and a look of profound reconsideration on his face. The others were in various states of horizontal around the room. Dot, behind the bar, watched all of this with the expression of someone who was adding up the cost of the damaged furniture. Caleb Holt straightened up, breathing a little hard, and turned to Eliza. He looked at her with those winter sky eyes, pale gray-blue and direct, and then he looked down at her dress, and a look of something that was not quite embarrassment but was in its neighborhood crossed his face. The brawl had raised a considerable amount of dust from the sawdust-covered floor, and the hem and lower portion of her dark blue skirt were now visibly coated in it, the fine dry grit of it settling in the fabric like gray lace. He reached into his back pocket and produced a cloth that was clean enough, folded it twice, and without saying anything at all, he crouched down in front of her and began, with a gentleness that was almost startling given what she had just watched those hands do, to brush the thick dust from the hem in front of her dress. He worked methodically, the cloth moving in careful strokes, and he did not look up at her while he did it. His jaw was set, and his expression was something she could not quite read. It was the act of a man who understood that the violence, however necessary, had imposed itself on her, had dragged its mess into her world, and who felt some obligation to restore what could be restored. When he finished, he stood up, tucked the cloth away, and looked at her directly. "Are you hurt?" he said. She found, to her mild irritation, that it took her a moment to answer. Not from fear, she was quite sure of that, but from something else entirely that she was not prepared to examine in the middle of a wrecked saloon. "No," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. Then he picked up her reticule, which had fallen from her lap to the floor in the confusion, and set it on the table in front of her with the same deliberate care. He looked as though he was about to say something else, and then thought better of it, and turned to leave. "Wait," Eliza said before she could stop herself. He stopped and turned back. The saloon around them was very quiet, or at least quiet relative to what it had been 5 minutes ago. Several men were watching. Dot behind the bar was watching most intently of all. "I don't know your name," Eliza said. Something shifted in his face. "Caleb Holt." "Eliza Calloway." She paused. "I came in for supper. Would you?" She stopped. This was not something she would normally do. This was not the kind of thing a woman alone in a frontier town said to a stranger who had just distributed 5 drunk miners around a saloon floor. But then, she was not normally the kind of woman who had arrived in a frontier mining town alone with a schoolteacher's letter and nothing else, and she was finding that the person she was in ordinary circumstances was being modified somewhat by the person she apparently needed to be in these ones. "Would you sit with me while I eat?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she could not tell what he was thinking. Then he pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down, and Dot appeared from behind the bar almost immediately with 2 plates of stew and 2 cups of coffee, wearing the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this outcome. Caleb Holt was not, it turned out, a man who talked easily. He was not shy exactly, she decided within the first few minutes. He was just careful. He chose his words the way someone might choose footing on an uncertain trail, testing each one before putting his weight on it. She learned, over the course of that first supper, with the saloon slowly returning to its normal noise around them and the moaning miners being helped outside by their friends, that he had been in Colorado for 6 years, that he had a cabin up in the mountains northeast of town about 8 miles, that he came down to Dustfield perhaps once a month for supplies, and that he trapped and hunted and had a small operation growing and selling dried herbs and medicinal plants to the apothecary in town, none of which, when she thought about it, explained quite why a man who lived 8 miles up a mountain had happened to be walking through a saloon door at precisely the moment she needed someone to walk through it. She said as much, and for the first time he smiled, and it did something to his face that changed it entirely, opening it up in a way that made him look younger and considerably less formidable. "I wasn't in the saloon," he said. "I was walking past on the street. I heard a woman's voice saying no clearly enough that it carried through the doors and over the piano." Eliza absorbed this. "And you came in?" "Yes." Without hesitation. "Did it seem like I hesitated?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "It did not." They sat a while longer. The stew was surprisingly good, thick with potatoes and beef and flavored with dried sage, and the coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon in. She told him she had come to teach school. He asked how many students she expected. She said she'd been told anywhere between 12 and 20, depending on the season, and how many families were staying in the area permanently rather than following the silver. He nodded at this as though it made sense to him. She asked if there were children in the mining families. He said there were some. He said there were also families who had come not for the silver, but to homestead the valley east of town, where the soil was better, and those families tended to stay, and they had children. She found herself thinking of the school, the small one-room building she had not yet seen, and the children she had not yet met, and felt the first real warmth of anticipation she had felt since buying her stage ticket in Denver. When she stood to leave, he stood immediately as well, which was the natural thing, but also had, in the context of the evening, a particular courtliness that she noticed. He walked her across the street to the hotel door without being asked. He stood with his hat in his hands on the boardwalk while she thanked him and told him she hoped the next time she saw him, there would be less violence involved. He said he hoped the same. She went inside, and she stood at the window of the hotel lobby and watched him walk back down the main street, and he was very large and unhurried in the dusty evening light, and she watched him until he turned a corner and was gone. That night, lying in the narrow hotel bed, she thought about a number of things. She thought about the school and the children and the chairman, Mr. Briggs, whom she would meet tomorrow. She thought about the town of Dustfield and whether it was going to prove to be more difficulty than it was worth, and decided that difficulty was not, by itself, a reason to leave. She thought about her wrist, which had a bruise coming up on it in the shape of a hand, and she thought about the way Caleb Holt had looked at that bruise before he crouched down to brush the dust from her dress, the way his jaw had tightened, the look in those pale gray eyes. She thought about him for a good deal longer than she thought about the school. Morning came with the sound of the town waking up, horses and wagon wheels and voices, and the thin, high-altitude light of a Colorado summer pressing through the curtains. Eliza washed her face in the basin, pinned up her hair, and put on her best dress, which was a dark green cotton that had been made for church and civic occasions back in Missouri, and was holding up reasonably well. She went downstairs and ate breakfast in the hotel dining room, which was now open and populated by a handful of other guests, none of whom were the men from the saloon. Mr. Harlan Briggs arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, as Mr. Pruitt had predicted, and proved to be a compact, businesslike man of 50 or so, with a gray mustache and the manner of someone who had organized a great deal and found it efficient to get directly to the point. He shook her hand, sat down across from her in the hotel parlor, and within 20 minutes had given her a complete account of the school situation, the salary, the small house that had been built adjacent to the school for the teacher's use, and the conditions of her employment, which included the understanding that she was to be paid in silver or its paper equivalent, that she was to provide her own supplies beyond the most basic, and that she was to begin as soon as the schoolhouse was ready, which he estimated would be another 3 weeks. 3 weeks in the hotel was an expense she had not entirely planned for, but she had her savings, and the school committee was providing the room on their account, so she thanked Mr. Briggs, shook his hand again, and went to see the schoolhouse. It was on the northern edge of town, a single-room building of rough-hewn logs with a plank floor and 4 windows and a blackboard that someone had painted directly on the interior wall with actual blackboard paint, which struck her as a particular thoughtfulness. The small house beside it was likewise rough but solid, with 2 rooms, a sleeping area, and a kitchen with a wood stove and a porch with a view of the mountains. Eliza stood on that porch in the morning light and looked at the mountains and thought about what it would mean to stay here, to make this place her own, to plant herself in this rocky soil and see what grew. She thought she could do it. She thought this quite firmly. She also thought, standing on that porch and looking at those mountains, that somewhere up in those peaks was a cabin where a large solitary man lived alone and came down to town once a month. And she found this thought settling in her chest with an odd warmth that she was not entirely sure she trusted. The 3 weeks passed. Eliza furnished her small house with what the mercantile and the hotel could provide, which was not much but was sufficient. She got to know the town in the way that women in frontier settlements got to know things, through the spaces between the public business of the place, through conversations with Dot at the saloon when she picked up the food that the Silver Spurs kitchen sold ready-made at noon, through the apothecary's wife, Mrs. Harding, who was the closest thing Dustfield had to a society woman, and who made it her business to know everything that happened within a 3-mile radius. Through Mrs. Harding, Eliza learned more about Caleb Holt than she might have otherwise gathered. He had come to Colorado from Wyoming, Mrs. Harding said, though nobody knew exactly what had brought him or what he had left behind. He had built the cabin up on the mountain himself, with his own hands, felling and hewing the timber and laying the stone himself over the course of a single hard autumn, which people in town found both impressive and vaguely alarming. He was known to be absolutely reliable in his word and absolutely inflexible in his standards, both of which qualities Mrs. Harding delivered with the tone of someone who found them admirable in principle and slightly inconvenient in practice. He did not drink, which was unusual. He did not gamble. He came to town for what he needed and went back to the mountain with it, and he kept his own company and asked nothing of anyone, and had done so for 6 years without complaint or apparent loneliness. "Until last Friday, of course," Mrs. Harding said, with a particular expression that communicated volumes about her opinion of last Friday and its significance. Eliza said, with great composure, that she was fortunate Mr. Holt had been passing by. Mrs. Harding said, with the confidence of a woman who had been observing human nature for 60 years, that she did not think fortune had much to do with it. The school opened on the 3rd Monday of August, and there were 17 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, which was a wider range than Eliza had been warned to expect, but which she found, after the first morning, to be something she could manage. The children were curious about her in the way that frontier children were curious about everything, directly and without the social varnishing of more established places, and she found that she liked this. A small girl named Alice Perkins, who was 7 and had large, solemn eyes and hair the color of straw, attached herself to Eliza with the particular fidelity of a child who has recognized something trustworthy, and this attachment, conducted through small offerings of wildflowers and insistent hand-holding during the morning walk from the town to the schoolhouse, was one of the things that sealed for Eliza the decision she had already made without quite knowing it, which was that Dustfield was going to be her home. She did not see Caleb Holt for 3 weeks after the night in the saloon. She told herself this was not surprising and was not, in any case, something she was paying particular attention to. She was, of course, paying considerable attention to it. He appeared on a Tuesday in mid-September, coming down the main street on a large roan horse with a pack behind the saddle, riding with the unhurried ease of a man who has spent enough time on horseback that the two of them have reached some mutual understanding. She saw him from the window of the mercantile, where she was purchasing chalk and a bolt of calico fabric to make a map. She did not go outside. She finished her purchases, settled her account with Mr. Dawes behind the counter, and walked out onto the boardwalk with her parcel, and she looked up and down the street in what she hoped was a natural way. He was at the apothecary across the street, unloading something from the pack on his horse, and he looked up as she came out, and their eyes met across the dusty width of the main street of Dustfield, Colorado, and he straightened up slowly and nodded at her, and she nodded back, and then he went back to what he was doing, and she walked in the direction of the school. 20 steps later, she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Miss Calloway." She turned. He was standing 3 feet away, his hat in his hand, and up close in the daylight he was even larger than she remembered, though that might have been because she had been sitting down the first time and standing up now. He was wearing a buckskin coat over his canvas shirt, and his hair was slightly damp, as though he had washed up before coming into town. And the thought of this, of him making that small, deliberate preparation, made something shift pleasantly in her chest. "Mr. Holt," she said, "how are you?" "Well," he said, "you're teaching school." "I started 3 weeks ago." She adjusted the parcel under her arm. 17 students. He looked at her with those steady gray-blue eyes, and she had the particular sensation she sometimes had in his presence of being seen clearly, without the usual social softening. It was not an uncomfortable sensation, she had decided. It was honest, and she respected honesty. "I heard there was a problem at the hotel last week," he said. "2 men arguing outside your window, that you had to call for Mr. Pruitt at 2 in the morning. She blinked. "How did you hear that?" "You were up on the mountain." "I was in town yesterday for salt. Dawes mentioned it." She considered this. It was nothing serious. They were drunk and argumentative, and I opened my window and told them to be quiet, and eventually Mr. Pruitt dealt with them. His jaw tightened in a way she was beginning to recognize. It shouldn't have happened. "No," she agreed. "It should not have. But a great many things that should not happen do happen in mining towns, and I am becoming reasonably equipped to deal with them." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you?" "I believe so." "Is there anything you need?" he said, and the question was direct enough that it surprised her. "From the mountain. Anything useful. I have dried medicines, feverfew and yarrow and some other things. It can be useful for a school." She thought about the children and the scrapes and the occasional feverish forehead she had already encountered in the first 3 weeks of school. "Yarrow would be useful," she said. "What would you want for it?" He looked as though the question puzzled him slightly. "Nothing," he said. "I don't take charity, Mr. Holt." "It's not charity," he said. "I have more than I can sell. It would go to waste otherwise." She studied him. "Then I will bring you a jar of the apple preserves I made last week from the orchard behind the school. The apple tree appears to be the only legacy of whoever owned this land before the school committee did." Something moved in his face that was almost a smile. "Fair enough," he said. He brought the yarrow to the school the following Saturday morning, a large paper-wrapped bundle of the dried herb that she could already see would last a considerable time, and she had the preserves ready on the kitchen table when he knocked, which he did properly at the door rather than just walking in, which she found she appreciated. He stood in the doorway of her small house with the bundle of herbs, and she stepped back to let him in, and he came in carefully, the way a large man always comes into a small space, turning slightly sideways through the door and keeping his elbows in, and she showed him where to put the herbs on the kitchen shelf and poured him a cup of coffee without asking, because she had already decided that he was the kind of man who took coffee and that not offering it would be a kind of missed opportunity. He sat at her kitchen table, which was small enough that his hands looked very large on it, and drank his coffee, and she sat across from him, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. She was not sure how it happened, because neither of them was what she would have called a natural conversationalist. But they fit together in some way she could not entirely explain, his silences comfortable rather than awkward, her questions finding the seams in his reticence and opening them to something warmer underneath. She learned about Wyoming, which he had left because of a dispute over land, his land, that he had worked for 5 years and that had been taken by men with lawyers and local judges on their side, and his voice when he talked about this was flat and controlled in a way that told her the feeling underneath it was not flat at all. She told him about Missouri and her father and the dry goods store, and he listened the way he did everything, with his full attention, with a stillness that was not passivity, but the opposite of it, a concentrated presence that she found both unusual and deeply pleasant. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door, and he stopped on the porch and looked at the mountains. "On a clear day," he said, "you can see the cabin from this porch, the glint of the roof in the afternoon." She looked in the direction he was looking, at the long blue-gray mass of the mountains rising behind the town. "Which direction?" she said. He pointed, and she looked along the line of his arm, which was very close to her face, and she could see, very distantly, what might have been a glint, or might have been a rock face catching the sun. "I see it," she said, though she was not entirely certain she did. He lowered his arm and looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning was cool and bright and smelled of pine and dust, and the school building beside her house cast a long shadow across the dry grass. Something was happening between them that she thought they were both aware of, and neither of them was quite ready to name. "I'll come back next month," he said. "I'll have more preserves," she said. He nodded and went down the porch steps to his horse, and she watched him mount up and ride north along the edge of town toward the mountain road, sitting very straight in the saddle, and she stood on the porch until he was out of sight. He came back in October and again in November, and the visits lasted longer each time. He brought things from the mountain: pine resin for treating chest congestion, dried calendula, once a haunch of venison that fed her for a week, and a pair of thick wool blankets he had traded for in Denver on a supply trip, which she protested and then accepted because the November nights at altitude were genuinely cold and her supply of blankets was insufficient, and he knew this because she had mentioned it in passing, and he had listened. He was always listening. She began to understand, over those autumn months, that this was one of the central facts of Caleb Holt. He listened to everything, the way he moved through the mountain listening to the wind and the timber, the way he tracked animals by listening to what the forest wasn't saying. He brought this same quality to the conversations she had with him, hearing not just the words but the weight behind them. She told him, in November, about the boy named Thomas Perkins, Alice's older brother, who was 12 and brilliant and in danger of losing access to school because his father wanted him in the mines. She told him about the conversation she had tried to have with Mr. Perkins, which had not gone well, and about her worry for Thomas, who had a quality of mind that should be nurtured and not spent underground in the dark. Caleb listened to all of this. He was quiet for a long time afterward. Then he said, "I'll talk to Perkins." She looked at him. "I don't want you to threaten anyone on my behalf." "I won't threaten anyone," he said. "I'll talk to him." She found out later, from Alice, who found out from Thomas, that Caleb had gone to see Mr. Perkins and had offered to help the man put in a fence line on his homestead claim east of town, a substantial job that would take several weekends in exchange for Thomas staying in school through the spring term. Mr. Perkins had agreed. Thomas stayed in school. By spring, he was the best student Eliza had ever taught, and he was working through an arithmetic textbook 2 years ahead of his level. She brought this up to Caleb on his December visit, which was longer than usual, because a snowstorm came in the afternoon and kept him in town overnight. He had a room at the hotel, but he had dinner with her at her kitchen table, and she cooked pinto beans and cornbread on the wood stove, while outside the snow came down in the heavy, serious way of Colorado mountain winters, and they sat at the small table with the lamp between them and talked while the wind pressed against the windows. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "About Thomas." "I know, but you did it anyway." He looked at her across the table, across the lamp, and something in his expression was different, more open than she had seen it, perhaps because of the warmth of the room or the snow outside, or simply the accumulation of all the months of growing familiarity. "There are things worth doing," he said, "regardless of whether they need to be done." She held his gaze. "That is a very fine thing to believe." "It's just a practical way to live," he said, with the particular self-deprecation that she had come to recognize as his way of deflecting a compliment. But his eyes didn't deflect, and hers didn't look away, and for a moment the small kitchen with its snow-fogged windows felt very close and warm and significant. She said, "I am glad you walked past that saloon in July." He was quiet for a beat. "So am I," he said, and the simplicity of it landed on her like a weight, gentle but complete, and she understood then with a clarity that was both sudden and entirely unsurprising that she had been in love with this man for some time. She did not say this. It was December, and they had known each other 5 months, and she was a schoolteacher with a reputation to maintain in a small town, and he was a mountain man with a private history, and they were both careful people. She said goodnight at the appropriate hour, and he went back to the hotel through the snow, and she lay in bed listening to the wind and thinking about his voice saying, "So am I," and she thought she probably slept at some point, though she was not entirely certain. He came back in January. He came in a storm that had closed the mountain road for a week, coming down on foot through the last 2 miles when his horse could not go further, appearing at the school door on a Monday afternoon after the children had gone home with snow on his coat and in his hair and on the beard that had grown heavier in the cold. And she had him inside immediately without questioning whether it was appropriate, pulling his coat off his shoulders and hanging it by the stove and putting the kettle on and finding the extra blanket he had brought her in November. He sat in the kitchen chair, thawing out slowly, and he did not explain why he had come down in a storm, and she did not ask, and they both understood perfectly well that the explanation was her. He stayed 2 days because the road was impassable, and they fell into a pattern that felt both new and deeply familiar. Him doing the heavy work around the place, splitting the wood that had been getting low, repairing the hinge on the kitchen window that had been sticking since October, while she cooked and brought him coffee. And in the evenings they sat at the kitchen table or beside the stove and talked, or did not talk, and both were equally good. On the second evening, he said with the careful deliberateness that characterized all his most important utterances, "I have been thinking about a number of things lately." She set down the mending she had been pretending to do. "What kinds of things?" He looked at his hands on the table, then up at her. Whether it would be a reasonable thing to ask if a woman might like to come up the mountain and see the cabin. She considered this for a very proper interval, which was approximately 3 seconds. "A woman might like that very much," she said. The relief on his face was slight, but it was there, and she found it one of the most endearing things she had ever witnessed, this large, immovable man showing relief at her answer. "Spring," he said, "when the road is clear." "Spring," she agreed. The rest of January was quiet, the town locked in its mountain winter, the school going through its cold, diminished days with children bundled in every layer they owned, the mountains pressing in on all sides under their heavy white weight. Eliza thought about spring with a particular warmth. She thought about the cabin with the glinting roof that she may or may not have seen from her porch. She thought about Caleb Holt on his mountain and what it would be like to see where he lived, to see the space that had shaped the person he had become. She also thought about the town and what it thought of their arrangement, such as it was. Mrs. Harding had been increasingly interested in the question of Caleb's visits, and the fact that he had spent 2 days at Eliza's house during the January storm was the kind of thing that did not go unnoticed in a community of Dustfield's size. Mrs. Harding had said, with great delicacy, that she hoped Eliza was being mindful of her reputation. Eliza had said that she valued her reputation and had been entirely circumspect in all her dealings with Mr. Holt, which was absolutely true, and that she also found herself uninclined to regulate her associations based on gossip, which was also true and somewhat less diplomatically received. Caleb came down again in February and in March, and each time the visits were longer and the conversations went deeper, moving through territory that courtship rarely charts so directly, but that they seemed to arrive at naturally, because they were both people who had been alone for a long time and had stopped pretending that what they wanted was other than what it was. He told her about Wyoming in more detail, about the land he had lost and the man responsible for it, a cattle baron named Alderson who had used his legal connections to bury Caleb's claim, and about the decision he had made to walk away rather than pursue it through violence, which had been against every instinct he had but which he had made because he had understood, at 26, that there was a difference between justice and revenge, and that one of them was worth having, and the other would cost him more than the land had. She told him about a man she had been engaged to in Missouri, briefly before her father died, a respectable man from a respectable family who had been perfectly adequate in every way, and who she had liked well enough but had not loved, and who had broken the engagement when it became clear that her father's death had left the store in debt and her with no dowry. She told this story without particular bitterness, because she had long since decided that his departure had been, in the final calculation, a mercy. Caleb listened to this story with the jaw-tightening expression she knew well by now. "He was a fool," he said. "He was practical," she said fairly, which is not the same thing. "In this case," Caleb said, "it is." Spring arrived the way it always did in the Colorado mountains, later and faster than you expected, the snow giving way in the high valleys with startling speed once it decided to go, and the mountain road clearing in the last week of April. Caleb sent a note down with a passing trapper on a Thursday, which she received on a Friday, saying the road was clear and would she come up on Saturday. She wrote back yes via the same trapper, who was making the return trip, and looked mildly put upon at being used as a postal service, but did not decline. She rode up the mountain on Saturday morning on the chestnut mare she had been boarding at the livery since March, a purchase she had made partly for the practical independence it gave her, and partly, if she was honest, because the mountain road had been clearing in her mind all through the winter, and she had wanted to be ready for it. The road wound up through ponderosa pine and aspen, the aspens just coming out in their first translucent green of the year, and the air thinned gradually and turned sharper and cleaner than anything at town altitude. She had lived in Missouri her whole life before Dustfield, and the mountains still struck her, every time she properly looked at them, as something miraculous. Caleb met her where the road ended, and the track to his cabin began, standing in a small clearing with the light through the aspens falling in long, pale shafts. He was wearing a clean shirt, and he had trimmed his beard, which she noticed and which settled in her chest as something sweet. He took her horse's bridle and helped her dismount with the particular care of a man who manages to be helpful without being condescending. And they walked the last half-mile to the cabin together, her horse following on a lead. The cabin was everything she had imagined, and nothing like it. It was larger than she had expected, 2 proper rooms with a covered porch on the south side. The logs fitted so precisely that she could see no gaps. The roof weighted against the winter snows with extra timber that he had laid with a craftsman's precision. Inside it was spare but not empty. A stone fireplace that took up half the north wall, shelves of organized tools and medicines and dried foods. A table he had made himself from a single plank of pine, 2 chairs, and a sleeping room with a bed frame of thick-hewn timber that looked as though it could withstand considerable use. On the shelves she saw books, which she had not expected, though she did not know why. A Bible and a volume of Shakespeare, and several histories, and what appeared to be a surveying manual, all of them read and reread to judge by their condition. "You have books?" she said. "I read in the evenings," he said simply. She looked at him with the particular warmth she had come to associate with moments when he showed her something about himself that she had not known. "What are you reading now?" He took a volume down from the shelf and handed it to her. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The pages were marked in pencil at intervals. She opened to one marked page and read the underlined passage. "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." She looked up at him. He was watching her with a directness that made the rest of the room recede. "That seems very you," she said. "I thought so too," he said, "when I read it." She stayed the day. He showed her the spring he had dug and lined with stone that was the cabin's water supply, and the kitchen garden on the south slope that he had just planted, and the place on the eastern edge of his land where the elk came in the early morning. She stood at that eastern edge and looked out over the valley below, the town just visible as a collection of tiny rooftops in the haze of distance, and she thought about what it would mean to live here, to look down at the world from this altitude, and whether this was a thought she was entitled to have. She decided, standing at the eastern edge of Caleb Holt's land with the wind in her hair and the enormous sky above her, and him standing close enough that she could feel the warmth he put out, which was considerable, that the question of entitlement was less relevant than the question of wanting, and that she had stopped being uncertain about what she wanted. She turned to him and he was already looking at her, and she said, "Caleb," which was the first time she had called him by his given name, and the effect of it on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life. He took one step toward her, and she took one step toward him, and there was a moment of suspension, of the world pausing on the cusp, and then he put his hands on her face with the same deliberate gentleness with which he had once brushed the dust from her dress, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the valley below them and the sky above them and the wind and the aspens and the very considerable distance between where they stood and to any other human being on earth all seemed to approve. They stayed on the porch after that, talking for a long time as the afternoon moved toward evening, his arm around her and her head finding its place against his shoulder, as though it had always known where that was. She did not stay past dark. He saddled her horse and walked with her back to the main road, and before she rode, he held her hand between both of his and said, in the careful, deliberate voice that he used for the things that mattered most, "I would like you to come back." "I know," she said. "I'll come next Saturday." He let go of her hand and she rode down the mountain, and she was warm all the way back to town despite the cooling evening air. She went back the next Saturday, and the one after that, and the Saturdays became a fixed point in the week that everything else arranged itself around. The town noticed. Dustfield was not a town that could be kept ignorant of such things, and opinions were mixed in the way opinions in small communities always are, some people pleased and some people disapproving. And Mrs. Harding, who had apparently decided to come down firmly on the side of the pleased, told Eliza that everyone could see they were well matched and that she hoped Mr. Holt would make his intentions formal before the winter came again. He made them formal before the summer was over. He came down on a Wednesday evening in July, which was unusual, not on his regular monthly supply trip, and knocked on the door of her small house with the same propriety he always brought to it. And when she answered, he was standing on the porch with his hat in his hand and a look of concentrated determination on his face that she recognized from the moment in the saloon when he had put his hand on the sandy-haired miner's arm. He asked her if she would marry him. He said it simply and without ornament, in the direct way of someone who has thought carefully about the right thing to say and has concluded that the right thing is the plain truth. He said that he had never met a woman who made him feel less alone in his mind, and that he understood this was not a conventional declaration, but that she was not a conventional woman, and he thought she might prefer the honest one. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She said it, and then laughed at herself for the inelegance of it, and he laughed too, which was one of the warmest sounds she had ever heard, and she stepped forward, and he put his arms around her and held her on the porch in the July evening with the mountains at their backs and the town lamplit before them, and she thought she had never in her life felt so precisely in the right place. They were married in September by the circuit preacher who came through Dustfield every 6 weeks. It was a small ceremony in the schoolhouse, because the church was still under construction, and the schoolhouse was the largest clean space available, and Eliza was, after all, its resident authority. The children had made a paper garland that hung along the blackboard wall. Mrs. Harding had organized a supper for afterward that involved an improbable quantity of food for a frontier town, appearing as though she had been planning it for longer than the engagement had existed. Dot from the Silver Spur brought 2 bottles of champagne that had come all the way from Denver, and Mr. Pruitt from the hotel looked genuinely moved, which Eliza would not have predicted. Caleb wore his best clothes, which were a black coat and trousers that he had bought in Denver and that fit his large frame perfectly, and he stood at the front of the schoolhouse and watched her come down the single center aisle between the children's desks with an expression that she would later describe as the most honest and unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. He took her hand when she reached him, and his hand around hers was warm and steady and absolutely certain. The preacher asked his questions, and they said their words, and Caleb's voice, when he said them, was the deep, even voice she had first heard in the saloon, saying that is not how you treat a lady. And it had the same quality now, quiet, but with everything behind it. After the ceremony there was supper and dancing, though the dancing was limited by the available floor space, and Caleb danced with her once, slowly, with the careful movement of a man who is uncertain of the steps, but absolutely committed to getting them right. And she put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat and thought she would be content to stay in this exact moment for a very long time. They moved into the cabin on the mountain in late September, after the school term was well established. Eliza had arranged with the school committee to continue teaching through the spring term, and the arrangement was that she would ride down the mountain 3 days a week on the days she taught. This was not a common domestic situation for 1873, and there had been some discussion among the school committee about whether it was appropriate, but Mr. Briggs had the practical sense to recognize that Eliza Calloway, now Eliza Holt, was the best teacher Dustfield had ever had, and that the difficulty of the commute was her problem and not the committee's, and the arrangement was allowed. The cabin was different with 2 people in it. It expanded somehow, took on a different quality of warmth. Eliza brought her books and they added them to his on the shelves, and the shelves looked better for the mixture. She brought her good pots and the coffee mill and the jar of apple preserves she had been keeping back, and he made room for everything without needing to be asked. She rearranged the kitchen, and he watched her do it with the expression of a man watching something improve and approving of the improvement. They learned each other in the close and specific way of people who live together in a small space, far from other people, learned the rhythms and habits and the particular shape of each other's days. He was up before dawn, every day without exception, and she learned to wake to the sound of him building the fire before she rose herself. And there was something deeply comforting about this, about the knowledge that he was already moving through the world on her behalf before she had opened her eyes. She made breakfast, and he came in from whatever early task he had been doing, and they ate together at the pine table as the light came up over the eastern ridge and came through the south-facing windows and lit the cabin in the particular golden way of mountain mornings. She taught him, over that first winter, to read poetry in the way it should be read, aloud and with feeling, which he resisted for approximately 2 weeks before she caught him sitting by the fire, reciting Tennyson to himself in the unself-conscious way of someone who has stopped performing reluctance. She read to him in the evenings, sometimes from the histories and sometimes from the Shakespeare, and he listened with his full attention, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. He taught her to track. It began with the elk meadow, him showing her the signs in the early morning, the pressed grass and the tracks in the soft soil along the creek, and gradually expanded to include everything the mountain had to say, the way the bark of the aspen was scratched by elk in the rut, the direction of the wind and what it carried, the sound the pines made before snow and the different sound they made before rain. She was a quick student, and he was a patient teacher, and within a year she could read the mountain's news in the morning as naturally as she read the words of her school books. Their first winter in the cabin together was the winter that sealed them, she thought later. The mountain locked in white from November through late March, the snow deep enough by December that the trail to the road required snowshoes, the wind at altitude bitter and serious about its business. They were largely alone for weeks at a time, Caleb going down for supplies only when the road was passable and coming back quickly. And in those weeks the cabin was their entire world, and she found that the entire world was sufficient, was in fact more than sufficient, was full to the edges. She got to know the silence of him as well as she knew the speech of him, learned that his silence when they were working separately in the cabin, him at the table repairing a piece of tackle or sharpening a tool, her at the stove or at her books, was one of the best silences she had ever inhabited. She had spent years before this filling silences out of anxiety, keeping conversation going to prevent the uncomfortable gaps, and with him she found she did not need to, that the gaps were not uncomfortable but were the natural breath between things. She would look up from her book sometimes and find him watching her. Not in an unnerving way. In the way of someone who is checking that the most important thing in their world is still present and still real. The first time she caught him doing this, she raised an eyebrow, and he said, without embarrassment, "You look different when you read, like the whole of you goes somewhere." "Where do I go?" she said. "Somewhere good," he said. "You always come back looking like you've had a good visit." She thought about this. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said, with great definitiveness. "I like knowing you have good places to go." She set down her book. "What are your good places?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Here," he said. "This." He said it simply, encompassing the room and her in it with a slight movement of his head, and she understood that he meant it in the complete and unguarded way that had always been his way when he said the things that mattered. She got up and crossed the cabin and sat beside him on the bench by the window where he was working, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the warm solidity of him, and outside the window the snow was coming down in the slow, thick way it had at altitude, and the fire was good, and she was home. Spring came early the second year, or what counted for early at altitude, meaning the road was clear by the 1st of April rather than the middle of it, and Eliza went back to teaching for the spring term and found that Thomas Perkins, now 14, had been given a letter of admission to a school in Denver by a visiting educator who had happened to pass through Dustfield in February. Thomas was going to Denver in September. His father, Mr. Perkins, had come to the school to tell her, looking simultaneously proud and at a loss, and Eliza had held both the man's hands and told him that Thomas was going to do remarkable things and that he should be very proud, and Mr. Perkins had gone red in the face and cleared his throat several times and left. She told Caleb about it that evening, and he sat across from her at the table with something warm and quiet in his face that she had come to understand was his version of what other people expressed with great enthusiasm. He said, "That's because of you." "It's because of Thomas," she said. "It started because of you," he said, "because you saw what he was." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "It started because of you," she said, "because you went to see his father." He turned his hand under hers and held it. "We started it between us then," he said, and she thought this was as apt a description as she had ever heard of how the best things in her life had happened. Summer arrived, and the mountain became its other self, green and warm and full of sound, the creek running high from the snowmelt, the wildflowers coming up in the meadows with a determination that made winter seem provisional. They worked the summer together, Caleb expanding the garden on the south slope and adding a small chicken coop that Eliza had wanted since the second month of winter, when the absence of fresh eggs had become a genuine source of philosophical mourning. She helped him with the herb garden that supplied the apothecary, learning to distinguish the medicinal plants he cultivated and how to dry and pack them. And this work, with its particular combination of the practical and the careful, suited her in a way that surprised her with its completeness. In August, she told him she was carrying their child. She had known for 3 weeks before she told him, not from uncertainty but from wanting to know it herself first, to have a private relationship with this fact before it became their fact. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were sitting on the south porch with their coffee, the mountains visible in every direction, the morning still cool. She said it directly, the way she had learned to say direct things to him. He sat very still for a moment. Then he set his coffee cup down and turned to her and took her face in his hands in the way he had that first time on the east ridge of his land, and he looked at her for a long moment, and she could see that he was feeling something very large and was deciding how to contain it. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her, and she felt the long exhale of him against her hair and the arms around her tightening with something that was not tension, but its opposite, a deep and comprehensive relief. "You're not worried?" he said after a while. "A little," she said honestly, "but not very much. Are you?" He pulled back enough to look at her. "I'm terrified," he said with the same matter-of-fact honesty with which he said everything important, "and more happy than I know how to say." "That seems about right," she said. They decided, practically, that she would stop teaching at the end of September before the winter made the road impassable, and that she would spend the winter on the mountain. Mrs. Harding, when she heard, appeared at the cabin the following Saturday on her own horse, which impressed Eliza considerably, Mrs. Harding not being a woman who rode regularly, bringing a basket of useful items and an offer to come and stay for the birth when the time came. Eliza accepted this offer with genuine gratitude, both for the practical assistance and for the quality of care that it represented. The pregnancy proceeded through the autumn with a thoroughness that made Eliza revise several of her more confident opinions about her own physical resilience. She was not particularly sick, which was a mercy, but she was tired in a way that was new to her, a bone-deep tiredness that could not be entirely outrested, and the energy she had previously taken for granted required more careful management. Caleb watched over her with a completeness that she alternately found deeply comforting and, in her more independent moments, mildly excessive. She told him this on one afternoon in October, when he had come in from outside to check on her for the third time in an hour, and found her in perfect health reading a book by the fire. "I am not made of paper," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his defensive stillness. "I know that." "I'm going to be perfectly fine," she said. "I'm going to do what women have been doing since the beginning of human life on Earth. It is not a medical emergency." "No," he agreed. "You may stop looking at me as though I might vanish." His expression shifted. "I am not looking at you as though you might vanish," he said. "I am looking at you because you are the most important thing in my world, and I find I like to look at you." She opened her mouth and closed it. "That is a very unfair thing to say when I am trying to make a point about overprotection." He sat down in the chair across from her. Were you making a point about overprotection? I was, she said. I'm still making it. I hear it, he said. I will try to be less present. Not less present, she said. Just less anxious. I will try, he said, and she could see that he genuinely meant to, and she could also see that it was not going to be entirely successful, and she decided this was something she could live with very comfortably. The baby came in March, when the mountains were still under their winter cover and the wind was still serious, but the sun had started to stay longer, and the light had changed quality in the way that means spring is considering its approach. Mrs. Harding came up the mountain 2 weeks before the expected time and stayed in the small second room, and her competence and calm were exactly what the cabin needed when the night arrived. It was a boy. He came into the world at 3 a.m. with what Eliza could only describe as emphatic energy, announcing himself with the kind of conviction that suggested he had already formed strong opinions about being here. She held him in the lamplight afterward and looked at the red, indignant face of him and felt something move through her that was too large for any word she knew. Caleb had been on the porch for the hardest hours because Mrs. Harding had firmly directed him there, and he came in when she called him, ducking through the doorway and stopping when he saw her with the baby in her arms. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed and looked at the child, and his face was absolutely undone. Every careful guard dissolved, open in a way she had never seen, and that made her love him with a completeness that was almost frightening. He looks furious, Caleb said. He has strong feelings about everything already, Eliza said. I can see this is going to be interesting. Caleb put his finger against the baby's fist, and the fist opened and closed around it with the immediate and total grip of the newborn, and a look crossed his face that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. They named him James, after her father, which had been her only request and which Caleb had agreed to without a second's hesitation. James Holt proved to have his father's constitution and his mother's disposition, which was perhaps the best possible combination. He grew with the particular energy of mountain children, solid and quick and interested in everything. He was walking before Eliza had finished being surprised that he was sitting, and talking before she had adjusted to the walking, and by the time he was 2, he was following his father around the property with the concentrated devotion of a disciple, watching everything, absorbing everything. Eliza went back to teaching when James was 18 months, taking him with her on the teaching days, which required an arrangement with Alice Perkins, now 12 and delighted to serve as a half-time nursemaid that worked surprisingly well. The school had grown since she had started, 23 students now as more families settled in the valley, and the school committee had discussed building a second room. Mr. Briggs, who had followed the progress of her school with the proprietary pride of a man who had hired well, had also mentioned the possibility of a second teacher, which would mean she would have a colleague. Dustfield itself had changed in the years she had been there. The silver had slowed, which was the natural history of mining towns, but unlike some places that had grown up around a single resource and died with its depletion, Dustfield had diversified in the way that towns sometimes do when they have enough people who have decided to stay regardless of the original reason for coming. The valley east of town had good farms on it now. The cattle that had started coming through in the late 70s were bringing more traffic and with it more permanent settlement. The church had finally been completed in 1876, a proper stone building that stood at the top of the main street with a certain modest dignity. The Silver Spur had been sold to new management in 1877 and had improved considerably in character, though Dot was still behind the bar and probably always would be. She was sitting on the south porch of the cabin on an evening in the summer of 1878 when she thought about all of this. James, who was now 4 1/2 and very firmly of the opinion that the world existed primarily for his exploration and commentary, was inside with his father, who was reading to him in the deep, even voice that she could hear through the open window, and she could hear James's running commentary on the story, which was alternately approving and argumentative, and she could hear Caleb's patient responses, and the combination of those two voices in the warm evening air was the particular music of her life. She thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off the stage in front of the Dustfield Hotel in July of 1873, with a single leather trunk and a hat box and a letter from the school committee. She thought about that woman's careful steadiness and the loneliness behind it, the particular loneliness of someone who has been alone long enough to have made an accommodation with it while not entirely accepting it. She thought about the saloon and the 5 drunk miners and the sound of Caleb coming through that crowd before she had seen him, and the look on his face when he crouched in the sawdust and dust-filled air and brushed the grit from her dress with the same hands that had just cleared the room with them. She thought about how small that gesture had been and how large it was at the same time. He came out onto the porch. James had apparently been put to bed with relative success, though she could hear him still talking to himself in there, in the companionable, self-sufficient way he had developed as a second language. Caleb sat beside her in the other chair, and in the 5 years they had been together, the chairs had been moved closer, until there was barely space between them, which was a geography she approved of. "He is very invested in the opinion that the wolf should have won," Caleb said. "He has always had unconventional sympathies. He gets that from you." She looked at him sideways. "I have always sympathized with the wolf." He reached over and took her hand. The mountains were going through their evening change, the light pulling off the peaks and leaving them in the blue-gray shade of high-altitude dusk, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge, and the summer air was warm enough to sit in without a coat, and clear enough that you could see 10 miles in any direction if you knew where to look. "I am going to need to go up to the higher pasture tomorrow," he said. "The fence on the north edge wants repairing before the elk push through in the fall." "James will want to come," she said. "James can come," he agreed. "He is useful for small repairs." This was not entirely true, James's usefulness on repairs being more psychological than physical at age 4, but it was true that he was useful for Caleb's mood, which was at its most relaxed in the company of his son. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back without looking away from the mountains. "I found out today," she said, "that I'm expecting again." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes, which had the same quality they had always had in the first moments of receiving something important, a stillness before the warmth came through. "When?" he said. "Late winter. February, perhaps." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, against the steady beat under the canvas shirt. She could feel it even and strong under her palm. He was looking at her with the same undisguised quality that he had had on the morning she told him about James, the same large feeling that he held honestly and without performance. "Are you happy?" she said, though she could see the answer. "Past the capacity to say so adequately," he said, which was a more elaborate response than he usually gave her, and she recognized that she had pushed him somewhere the usual economy of his speech could not quite reach. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her. In the cabin behind them, James had fallen quiet, the small voice silenced in sleep, and the mountain settled into its evening sounds, the creek below and the wind in the high timber and the occasional far-off call of a nightbird over the meadow. She thought about the years ahead and found them good. She thought about the second child and what they would be, and the image of the 4 of them on this porch in some future summer arrived in her mind with such particularity and warmth that it felt less like imagination than like memory. She thought about the school and the children and Thomas Perkins in Denver, whom she had received a letter from in April, reporting that he had finished his first year of advanced study and had been recommended for a position as a junior surveyor with a Western mapping expedition the following year. She thought about Alice, who was 13 now and coming into the serious-minded, studious young woman that the 7-year-old with solemn eyes had been preparing to be all along. She thought about Dustfield, slowly becoming less wild and more permanent, losing some of its rough edges and gaining others that were merely different. The mountains did not change. She thought this too, with a particular comfort. Whatever happened in the valleys, the mountains remained what they were, vast and indifferent and astonishingly beautiful. And they had been this way before any of them arrived and would be this way long after, and living in sight of them gave the days a quality of proportion that she found she needed. "I was thinking today," she said, "about the saloon." "Were you?" "About when you knelt down and brushed the dust from my dress." He was quiet. "That was what told me," she said, "before I knew anything else about you. The fighting I expected from a man of your size in a situation like that, but not the other thing, not the care." He did not say anything for a moment, She could feel him thinking. "You deserved care," he said finally. "Most people do," she said. "Most people don't receive it as naturally as you gave it." "I was raised to respect women," he said. "It was the most important thing my mother taught me. She was a specific kind of woman, my mother. She would not have permitted anything less." Eliza had not known much about his mother, who had died when Caleb was 19. He had mentioned her only a handful of times, always with a respect that bordered on reverence. "What was she like?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment, the way he was when he was reaching for something that words made difficult. "She was completely honest," he said. "Not cruel about it, but honest. She said that the world had enough people in it who made things smaller and harder, and she intended to make things larger and easier wherever she could. She did that every day, even when it cost her." "She sounds wonderful," Eliza said. "She was," he said. "She would have liked you very much." "Why?" "Because you are completely honest," he said, "and you make things larger wherever you can." She thought about this for a while, and she thought about whether she lived up to it, and she thought that she tried to, that she tried every day in the classroom and at the kitchen table and on this porch and in the life she had built here in this unlikely place, and that trying was perhaps most of what could be asked. "Do you ever think about Wyoming?" she said. "Sometimes." "Do you miss it?" He thought about this properly, which was the only way he thought about things. "I miss some of it," he said. "The land, the particular way the sky looked over those hills. But the land here is good. This land is mine in every way that land can belong to a person. I built it. I know every foot of it." He paused. "And you are on it." She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him. "That last part is doing a lot of the work in that sentence." "It is," he agreed, and smiled, and the smile changed everything the way it always had from the first time she had seen it in the ruined saloon. She kissed him there on the porch in the summer evening, and he kissed her back with the wholehearted quality he brought to everything, and the mountains sat around them in their enormous ancient patience, and James slept inside with the untroubled depth of a child who had never had cause to doubt that the world was fundamentally good, which was perhaps the greatest thing his parents had given him. The second child came in February, as she'd predicted, a fierce cold February night when the wind was high and the stars were brilliant, and Mrs. Harding made the mountain journey again with the same competence and calm that had served them so well the first time. Eliza was better at it the second time, more practiced in the particular demands of it, and the labor was shorter if not exactly easy. And the child, a girl with dark hair and her father's gray-blue eyes, arrived just before dawn with considerably less drama than her brother had brought to the occasion. They named her Clara, after Caleb's mother, which had been his only request and which Eliza honored with the same uncomplicated willingness with which he had honored hers. Clara Holt, who had come into the world before the sun on a cold February morning, proved to be a child of surprising tranquility, which was either nature or the establishment of her own particular territory, in contrast to her brother's thoroughgoing occupation of every other available space. James regarded his sister for the first few days with the neutral assessment of someone who has been told a thing is going to happen and is reserving judgment until they have gathered sufficient data. Then, on the fourth day, Clara wrapped her fist around his offered finger in the way that newborns will, the total unthinking grip of new life, and James looked at this for a long moment, and then looked up at his father and said, with the gravity of 4-year-old authority, "She is keeping me." "I think she is," Caleb said. After that, James devoted himself to Clara with a steadiness that his parents found both touching and somewhat surprising, given his general approach to the world as a thing to be moved through rapidly. He brought her things, small rocks and interesting sticks, and once a considerably alarmed grasshopper. He sat beside her while she slept and reported on the activity to anyone who came near, with the manner of a night watchman making his rounds. He told her things in a quiet, continuous narrative that she could not yet understand, about the mountain and the elk and the creek and what their father had shown him, and Clara listened to all of this with her gray-blue eyes wide and attentive and something in her expression that looked like recognition. Spring came as it always did, sudden and generous after the long white winter, and Eliza went back to teaching in April, with both children now in her complicated domestic orbit, James old enough for school himself, which created the particular professional challenge of having one's son in one's own classroom, but which she managed with the equanimity she had developed for the various unusual features of her life. The school had its second room by then, and a second teacher, a young man named William Fry from Boston, who had come west with the idealism of the Eastern-educated class and was discovering, not entirely comfortably, that the frontier had opinions about idealism that it expressed through weather and distance and the basic stubbornness of physical reality. She liked Fry. He was earnest and genuinely good with the older children, and he was learning, under the double instruction of the Colorado Mountains and Eliza Holt, to be practical without being cynical, which she considered the most important educational achievement available. Dustfield in 1879 was a different place than the Dustfield of 1873. The stage ran twice a week now instead of once. There was talk of a rail line coming through the valley, which if it happened would change everything about the town's scale and character. The church had a regular minister, a young man named Pastor Cole, who was both devout and refreshingly free of the kind of judgment that made religion difficult for the people who needed it most. The school committee had grown to 7 members. The Silver Spur was now called the Mountain View and had a curtained dining room separate from the bar, which Dot ran with the same authority she had always brought to the whole establishment. She walked down the main street of Dustfield one April morning in 1879, James's hand in one of hers and Clara riding her hip, and she thought about the afternoon she had first walked down this street with her trunk and her hat box, the dust rising around her boots, the men on the boardwalk with their various attentions, the particular feeling of arriving somewhere alone. She could feel the difference between that woman and this one in her bones, in the specific gravity of belonging, and she felt for that younger self a kind of retrospective tenderness, because that woman had been brave in ways she was only now fully understanding, had come to a wild and uncertain place with nothing but her own steadiness to stand on, and the steadiness had held. The years unfolded. James grew tall like his father, with his mother's quick mind and his father's essential stillness. He was the best student in the school for years, which Eliza carefully refrained from acknowledging publicly while being thoroughly unsurprised by privately. Clara grew into the quiet, serious girl that her temperament had always promised, but with a warmth underneath the quiet that surprised people when they found it, which was Caleb in her, the deep warmth that lived beneath the still surface. Caleb expanded the cabin over the years, adding a second room and then a third, the logs fitted with the same precision he had brought to the original structure, the additions matching the original so naturally that visitors who had not known the cabin before could not tell where one ended and the other began. He expanded the herb garden and the kitchen garden and eventually, in 1881, added a small orchard of his own on the south slope to supplement the apple tree behind the school, which Eliza considered a particularly personal piece of agricultural poetry. He remained who he had been when she met him, perhaps more so. The years had not softened him in the direction of complacency. He was still the first up in the morning and the last with any important task undone. He still moved through the mountain with the attention of someone reading a text that repays close study. He still listened to her with his full presence every time, and when he had something important to say, he still waited carefully before saying it, and she still felt the weight of that care as a quality of respect that she did not take for granted. In the spring of 1882, they had a third child, another boy they named Robert, who came into the world with the easy good nature of a person who had looked at the situation and decided it was acceptable and had no quarrel with the arrangements. Robert, from almost his first days, seemed to find everything fundamentally amusing, which balanced the household in a way that neither Eliza nor Caleb had planned, but both appreciated. On a December evening in 1882, with the snow outside and the 3 children in bed and the fire good and the lamp burning on the pine table, Caleb said, without preamble, "I want to tell you something." Eliza set down her mending. She had learned that when he said this, it was something that had been carried for a while. He looked at her across the table. The firelight was warm on his face, on the strong lines of it, the beard now showing some gray at the edges, the dark hair still long and still its own particular kind of handsome. She thought she would probably always think him the most striking man she had ever seen, which she had also thought the first night in the saloon, and which had not changed in 9 years. "I came through Dustfield that night in July of 1873, he said, because I had come down from the mountain to look at a piece of property in the valley. I was thinking about expanding. The mountain was good, but it was lonely, and I had been thinking for a while that the kind of life I was living was missing something essential." He paused. "I was going to look at the property and then go home and decide. The next morning I was going to decide." "And," she said, "and I never did decide. About the property." He looked at her steadily. "Because I heard a woman's voice through a saloon door saying no, and I went in, and I sat at a table and ate supper with her, and on the way back to the hotel that night I thought that I had found the essential thing and that the property question was entirely beside the point." She was quiet for a moment. "You never told me that." "No." "You never looked at the property again." "No." She thought about this. About a man coming down from a mountain in search of something he could not entirely name, and finding it in a saloon full of dust and noise and difficult men. About the ways in which the essential things arrive, not through planning, but through the accidental specific details of a particular evening, a woman's voice through a door, 5 drunk miners, a cloth used to brush dust from a hem. "I'd been thinking for several months," she said, "before I applied for the school position, that I was done being alone, that whatever came next had to include something more than I had been allowing myself." She looked at him. "I wrote to 3 school committees that year. Dustfield was the only one that wrote back." His expression moved. "Is that true?" "It is," she said. "The other 2 did not have the courtesy to respond." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank God for discourtesy." She laughed, the full warm laugh that she had learned to trust herself in, and he smiled the smile that had changed his face from the beginning, and across the pine table in the firelight they looked at each other with the complete knowledge of 9 years and 3 children and a mountain and a life built board by board and season by season, and she thought that no one could have told her, standing on the main street of Dustfield with her hat box and her letter and her careful steadiness, that the world contained this much, that it could be this full. "I love you," she said, which she said every day and meant every time. "I love you," he said, which he said less often and meant entirely. Outside, the snow came down in the patient, serious way of Colorado mountain winters, and the fire was good, and the children were asleep, and the mountains surrounded the cabin in their ancient, enormous presence, and the lamp on the pine table burned its steady light against the dark, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the life they had made together on this mountain from a single accidental evening in a frontier saloon was complete in the way that only the very best things are complete, not finished, never finished, but whole, rounded and entire and full to its edges, with room yet for all the seasons still to come.